Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. Jason placed his glass of bourbon down on the polished walnut table, the amber light catching the smirk on his face. Dad, consider this my gift to you. $900,000 straight into your account. But remember now, you owe me, old man. The laughter that followed filled the office like static. Harold Bennett didn't answer. He just looked at his son, the boy he'd once carried on his shoulders to construction sites, now leaning back in a designer suit that probably cost more than Harold's first truck. His office smelled faintly of cedar and concrete dust, reminders of 30 years building Bennett & Sons construction from the ground up. Jason's smirk widened. You built your empire in the 80s, Dad. Things are different now. You're out of touch. Let me take over before you ruin what's left. Harold took a slow breath. If this is your way of saying thank you, noted. Jason chuckled. You'll see, it's for your own good. A week later, the bank called. Every account tied to the company was frozen. Harold sat in his kitchen that morning, phone pressed to his ear as the bank manager stammered apologies. Sir, we've received a legal hold on your business assets. It appears there's been a transfer of controlling interest to a new managing entity, Bennett Capital Holdings. Jason's company. He hung up without another word. Steam rose from his untouched coffee, curling in the air like a ghost of the life he thought he understood. On the table beside it lay a framed photo of his late wife Elaine, her smile calm, eyes full of quiet faith. He remembered her words the week before she passed. Promise me, Harold. Don't let success harden you. Don't forget family comes before business. He had kept that promise, or thought he had. Now his only son had turned that legacy into leverage. When Jason was a boy, he'd sit at Harold's drafting table for hours, tracing blueprints with crayons. He used to say, "Someday I'll build taller buildings than you, Dad." Harold had laughed, then proud of the ambition. But ambition, he'd learned, could rot when it grew without roots. Jason's version of building taller meant playing financial games, risk, leverage, manipulation. He wasn't interested in bricks or beams, only balance sheets and control. Harold had always hoped time would teach him humility. Instead, money had taught him arrogance. He replayed Jason's words in his mind. Now you owe me, old man. Owe him. Harold had spent decades working 14-hour days, saving every dime, putting Jason through Wharton, buying his first condo, even paying off the startup loans Jason had defaulted on. $900,000. To Jason, it was a statement of dominance. To Harold, it was a declaration of war. By afternoon, Harold was in his office staring at the frozen company accounts on his laptop. The Bennett & Sons logo sat mockingly in the corner of the screen. Decades of contracts, assets, and reputation now legally paralyzed. He called Laura Myers, the family attorney who had managed his trust since Elaine's passing. "Laura, I need you to look into something," he said. She didn't ask questions. "Jason again, yeah. He gave me a gift. $900,000. But the bank says he now controls the company." Laura's sigh was heavy. That transfer wasn't a gift, Harold. It was a legal setup. If you accepted those funds and acknowledged them in any document, Jason could interpret it as a capital infusion, effectively buying controlling interest. So he tricked me into selling my own company. Not selling, surrendering. Silence filled the line. Harold rubbed his temples, feeling the dull pulse of betrayal in every heartbeat. Can we reverse it? Maybe. Depends how deep he buried the paperwork. That evening, he drove home through the dusky Denver streets, headlights slicing through the late spring rain. The city had grown around him. New towers, new rules, new sons who thought they were gods. He parked in front of his brick house, the same one he'd built with Elaine 30 years ago, and sat in the truck long after the engine stopped. Inside, the hallway was dim. Family photos lined the wall, Jason at graduation, Jason at the groundbreaking ceremony for their first skyscraper. Each frame felt like a knife now. Harold poured himself a drink and sat in his recliner. The television played quietly, some news anchor, talking about market volatility. He barely heard it. What echoed louder was Jason's laughter. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, back when he was supervising young engineers fresh out of college, too sure of themselves to listen. Back then, arrogance just cost time or materials. Now, it cost blood. At midnight, Harold walked into his home office. He opened a drawer and took out a worn leather notebook. Elaine's handwriting on the first page. Every plan starts with knowing what you're fighting for. He wrote 2 words beneath it. My family. Then one more, justice. The clock ticked steadily behind him as he made notes, company names. Jason's shell corporations, the account numbers Laura had given him years ago. He'd built skyscrapers, but he also built systems, and he knew how to dismantle them. He was old, yes, but not obsolete. Morning came gray and silent. Harold brewed black coffee and opened the curtains. Across the street, Jason's Tesla glided into his driveway like a silver blade. The door opened and his son stepped out, phone glued to his ear, laughing again. Harold watched through the window, jaw tightening. He remembered teaching Jason to drive his hands steady on the wheel, Jason shouting, "I've got it, Dad," back when trust still meant something. Now that same son was orchestrating his downfall. The front doorbell rang minutes later. Jason stood outside, all charm and confidence. "Morning, Dad. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're taking the news." "What news?" Harold asked. "Oh, come on. Don't play the victim. Business is business. You should have known better than to run a modern company on old instincts. Consider this a transition of power." Harold's lips curved in a faint smile. "A transition of power, huh?" Jason leaned against the doorframe. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Retire gracefully. Enjoy your pension. Maybe I'll even keep your name on the company letterhead for nostalgia." He clapped his father's shoulder too hard, like a pat disguised as a shove. Then he walked away. Harold closed the door and exhaled slowly. His eyes landed on the framed construction license hanging beside the coat rack, his name embossed in gold. Harold Bennett, licensed structural engineer. He touched the edge of the frame. Time to remind him, he murmured, who built the foundation he's standing on. That night, Harold met Laura in her downtown office. They went over Jason's filings, cross-referencing dates, signatures, transfer statements. Laura tapped a page. "See this clause? Jason transferred ownership through an intermediary, his firm 3 days before you signed the acknowledgement of funds. He anticipated your consent before you gave it. That's fraud." Harold leaned back, expression calm. "So he made his move first." "Yes, but that means he also left fingerprints." A small smile touched Harold's lips. "Then let's start dusting for prints." He closed the folder, stood, and looked out at the Denver skyline. The lights shimmered across glass towers he'd helped build. Somewhere among them, his son was celebrating victory. What Jason didn't know was that his father had built more than buildings. He'd built systems, networks, and a lifetime of people who still owed him favors. He'd taught Jason everything about ambition. Now he'd teach him the price of arrogance. The sound of steel echoed in the cold morning air. Harold Bennett wiped frost from his gloves, lifted another beam into place, and secured it with the precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. Snow fell gently over the unfinished structure, a modest two-story office that would one day house his company's first headquarters. In the distance, a 5-year-old boy in a red wool hat stood watching, eyes wide with awe. "Someday I'll build something bigger than this," Dad Jason shouted, his voice bright and full of pride. Harold laughed, his breath forming clouds in the winter air. "Then make sure you build it strong, son. Not just tall strong." He didn't know that moment would become a memory he'd carry through every betrayal that followed. Years later, Harold could still feel that same December chill when he thought about where it all began. He had left the military at 30, with nothing but a few $1,000s, a second-hand truck, and a dream. Bennett & Sons Construction started from a rented garage and one worn set of tools. Harold poured everything into it, his sweat, his weekends, his 20s and 40s and 50s. Elaine, his wife, handled the numbers while he handled the steel. She was calm where he was stubborn, steady where he was fiery. When contracts fell through or clients delayed payment, she'd simply smile and say, "You build foundations, Harold. Even storms need something to fall on." By the late 90s, the company was thriving. Highways, schools, municipal projects, every contract was a new victory. When Jason graduated high school, Harold felt certain the future was secure. But Jason's idea of building was different. He grew up surrounded by success, private school ski trips, and a home that smelled of polished oak and fresh plans. To Jason, hard work wasn't something you did with your hands. It was something you managed from a distance. He wanted power, not process, and Harold, blinded by pride, didn't see the cracks forming. Jason went off to college in Boston, majored in finance, then MBA at Wharton. He came back full of big words: capital leverage, growth, equity, aggressive scaling. Harold barely understood half of it, but he nodded anyway. "He's smart," he'd tell Elaine. "Smarter than me." Elaine would smile gently. "Different, Harold. Just different." When Jason's first startup failed, Harold paid the debt. When the second one collapsed under mismanagement, Harold quietly sold one of their properties to cover the losses. Jason never thanked him. He said, "That's how business works, Dad. You take risks." The words stung more than Harold admitted. Then came the argument, the first one that didn't end in silence, but in distance. "You run this company like it's 1985, Jason said, pacing in the living room, expensive shoes clicking against hardwood floors. "You could double revenue if you'd let me handle investments." Harold looked up from his papers. "We build things people can touch. I don't need to gamble with what's already standing." Jason snorted. "That's why you'll never grow, Dad. You're comfortable. Maybe. But at least I sleep at night." That night, Elaine found Harold alone in his office, staring at a faded photo of Jason as a child. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "He'll learn," she said softly. "He just doesn't understand what you've sacrificed yet." "He doesn't have to," Harold replied. "He just has to respect it." 2 years later, Elaine was gone. Cancer came quietly then, all at once. She fought for 8 months, smiling even on the hardest days. On one of her final mornings, she asked Harold to promise something. "Don't let the company divide the family. If you and Jason can't agree, find balance. Family before business," Harold promised. At the funeral, Jason arrived late, phone in hand, taking calls between condolences. Harold didn't say a word. When it was over, he stood by Elaine's grave long after everyone had left, his breath misting in the cold air. "I'll keep it together," he whispered, "even if it kills me." For a while, it felt like Jason might soften. He took over client meetings, introduced new software, modernized the office. But every improvement came with a price. He wanted control more than partnership, more than guidance. One evening, Laura Myers, the family attorney, stopped by Harold's office with files in hand. "Jason's restructuring some of the accounts," she said carefully. "He's shifting company funds into new projects under his name." "Are you aware?" Harold frowned. He told me it was for digital expansion. Laura hesitated. Then I hope that's true. But you should keep an eye on the paperwork. Harold waved her off. He's my son, Laura. He just needs room to lead. That was the mistake. The following months blurred into long days and longer silences. Jason was everywhere: press interviews, podcasts, meetings with venture capital firms. He called himself the new generation of Bennett, and Harold watched as the company he built with calloused hands became a brand in sleek suits and glossy brochures. At home, the distance grew worse. Harold found comfort in his grandson Ethan, a bright 8-year-old with the same curious eyes Jason once had. They built miniature houses in the living room wood blocks, stacked carefully into tiny dreams. "Dad says you're too old for work," Grandpa Ethan said one afternoon, his small hands pressing pieces together. Harold smiled gently. "Maybe. But old men know how to make things last." When Ethan laughed, it sounded like hope. But even hope couldn't hide the truth. Jason's visits became rare, his tone colder, his eyes sharper. The son who once admired his father now treated him like a liability. Harold spent more nights in the workshop, fixing tools that didn't need fixing. One evening, he stood before the old company sign stored in the corner. Bennett & Sons Construction, the paint cracked dust thick along the edges. He ran a hand across it, tracing each letter. Elaine's words echoed in his mind. "Legacy isn't money, Harold. It's what your son remembers about you." He whispered back, voice rough. "Then I failed Elaine. He remembers everything, except who I am." The wind outside howled softly through the half-open window. Papers fluttered across the desk, blueprints rustling like ghosts of old dreams. Harold picked up one drawing, his first design from decades ago, a modest warehouse built to withstand storms. In the corner, a faded signature, H.H. Bennett, Chief Engineer. Below it, a childish scrawl in red marker, Jason Bennett, Future Boss. He smiled faintly, bitter and proud all at once. "You got half of that right, son," he murmured. "You became the boss. But you forgot the foundation." He set the paper down, straightened his back, and stared at the dark window reflecting his own weary face. "If legacy was all he wanted to steal," Harold said quietly, "I'd let him. But he took my name, and that I'll take back." Outside, the wind carried the scent of cold steel and memory. Inside, Harold Bennett, the man who built cities, realized he would have to rebuild something much harder: his own family. The glow from the laptop screen reflected in Harold's tired eyes. The house was silent, except for the hum of the furnace and the steady tick of the old clock above the mantel. On the screen, rows of numbers lined up in perfect order until one line caught his attention. Transfer Bennett Capital Holdings, $900,000. Memo equity contribution for management control transition. He leaned closer, his jaw tightening. That phrase, management control transition, didn't belong in any legitimate family transaction. It wasn't a gift. It was a purchase. He whispered to himself, "He didn't give me anything. He bought me out." The coffee on his desk had gone cold. He stared at the figures until the numbers blurred, until they no longer represented money, but betrayal measured in digits. The next morning, he sat across from Laura Myers in her small downtown office, the same woman who had handled every contract since the company's founding. She adjusted her glasses as she examined the documents Harold had printed out. "This isn't a gift, Harold," she said flatly. "It's a strategic equity acquisition. By accepting the transfer and acknowledging it as company funding, you've effectively granted Jason majority voting control." Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. "He used my signature." Laura nodded. "A digital acknowledgement. It looks like he embedded it from your quarterly financial approvals." He exhaled slowly, the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound he'd felt in his life. He used my trust as collateral. Laura folded her hands. We can contest it. But if he's already filed the ownership documents with the state, it's going to be difficult. You'll need proof that he misled you. Harold straightened his tone, colder than steel. Then I'll get proof. 2 days later, Jason called an emergency board meeting at the new Bennett Global office. Harold wasn't supposed to attend. He was listed as honorary consultant, not owner. Still, he walked in without invitation, ignoring the startled faces of the junior executives. Jason stood at the head of the polished glass table, exuding charm and confidence in his tailored navy suit. I appreciate everyone coming, he began smoothly. Today marks a transition in leadership. My father has decided to step back from active management while I move the company toward international expansion. Harold said nothing. He simply sat down in the nearest chair, arms crossed. A younger executive, clearly nervous, asked Mr. Bennett, "Will your father still have a say in operations?" Jason's smile was professional, but sharp. Of course. He'll remain as an advisor. But the decision-making needs to reflect modern realities. It's time the company had a leader who understands the global market. The room nodded. No one dared to challenge the new king. Harold stared at his son for a long moment, feeling both anger and pity. Jason's arrogance had blinded him to the one truth that built the company foundations matter more than facades. When the meeting ended, Harold left without a word. Outside, the wind was bitter, biting through his coat as he crossed the parking lot. He looked back at the towering glass building, Jason's vision of success, and realized it was as hollow as his son's pride. That night, he spread out documents across his kitchen table. Contracts, invoices, emails. Every paper trail Jason had touched over the last year. He began marking them with a pencil, cross-referencing bank statements and project reports. By midnight, he had his first pattern. Jason had funneled company funds into consulting fees paid to shell corporations, 3 of them linked to Bennett Capital Holdings, the same entity that had gifted Harold the $900,000. It wasn't just theft. It was fraud built to look like success. Harold called Laura. He's moving money offshore. Cayman, Switzerland, maybe Monaco. Laura hesitated. Harold, that's serious. You'll need someone who can trace this properly. I already have someone in mind. The next morning, he met an old friend, Jake Nolan, at a diner off Highway 36. Jake had left the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit years ago, but still had connections. He greeted Harold with a firm handshake. Been a while, Jake said. Heard about your son's fancy new empire? Harold gave a dry smile. It's about to crumble. I just need your eyes on some numbers. Jake flipped through the documents Harold handed him. You think he's laundering company assets? I think he's using them to buy himself a kingdom. Jake nodded. I can pull some records quietly. But Harold, once this starts, there's no going back. Are you ready to drag your own blood into this? Harold looked out the window at the passing trucks. I'm not dragging him anywhere. He walked into this by himself. Over the next week, Jake fed Harold updates. 3 offshore accounts, 2 registered shell corporations, 1 fake investment firm under Jason's name. Harold's suspicions hardened into certainty. But the final confirmation came from an unexpected place, Grace. One evening, she showed up at Harold's house, her eyes tired, her voice shaky. He's not the same anymore, she said, sitting at the kitchen table. He barely sleeps. Keeps taking calls at night. He says it's about global partners, but I saw an email with bank codes and foreign routing numbers. Harold's tone stayed calm. Why are you telling me this? Because he's crossing lines, Harold. He's lying to everyone, even to me. She pulled an envelope from her purse and slid it across the table. Inside were printed emails and scanned contracts, Jason's correspondence with a Cayman Islands contact about transferring liquid assets from company funds. Harold looked at the documents for a long time before speaking. "You've done the right thing, Grace. I just want Ethan to have a father who isn't ruined by greed," she whispered. Harold nodded. "Then let's make sure he still has a grandfather who can fix it." After she left, he sat alone for hours reading and rereading the files. Jason had built his empire on deceit, and now every beam of that structure was cracking under the weight of its lies. He closed his eyes, hearing Elaine's voice in his memory. "You can't teach integrity, Harold. You can only show it." He opened his notebook and wrote 3 words, Stage 1 complete. The next morning, Harold met Laura again. "We're going to let him move," he said. "Don't stop him yet." Laura frowned. "That's risky. It's necessary. The more he moves, the more evidence he leaves." She hesitated. "And what will you do?" Harold smiled faintly. "The same thing I've always done, build. This time I'm building a case." Over the next few days, Jason's behavior grew erratic. He moved meetings offshore, shifted accounts, and began whispering about transitioning leadership permanently. His arrogance had become desperation, disguised as confidence. Harold watched quietly. Every step Jason took made the web tighter, the pattern clearer. Late one night, as rain pattered against his window, Harold stared at the map of transactions pinned on his wall. Red strings connected companies' accounts and shell firms, like veins in a diseased heart. He murmured to himself, "He built a trap for me. Now I'll build one for him." He took a pen and circled the center of the diagram. Bennett Capital Holdings. That was where it would all collapse. Outside, thunder rolled over the city, and Harold Bennett, once the builder of steel and stone, prepared to construct his most enduring structure. Yet a wall of justice his son could never climb. Dawn broke over Denver with a pale gray sky, and Harold Bennett stood in his garage, opening an old metal toolbox that hadn't been touched in years. The smell of machine oil and cedar hit him like memory. Inside were tools from another life, his first hammer, a cracked level, a rusted tape measure, and beneath them a small black case filled with tech equipment from his company's early security contracts. Cameras, recorders, a scanner. He smiled faintly. "Construction taught me one thing," he murmured. "Nothing collapses overnight. It starts with cracks you didn't notice." He cleared off his workbench, laid out blueprints, not for buildings, but for the investigation. Every paper, every photo, every name connected to Jason's web of companies. He drew arrows, circled dates, and at the top of the page wrote 2 words in bold ink, Operation Containment. The light through the window caught the edge of his wedding ring, and for a moment, he thought of Elaine. She would have told him to stay calm, to build quietly. So that's what he'd do. By 9 a.m., he was sitting across from Laura Myers in her office, surrounded by case files and coffee cups. "I've spoken to a few people," she said. "There's a pattern. Jason replaced nearly all of your senior accountants with people tied to his investment group. They've buried the transactions so deep it'll take weeks to untangle." Harold nodded slowly. "We'll start with what's visible. Every contract he signed in the last 12 months. Get me copies." Laura hesitated. "You're really going to take him to court?" "Not yet," Harold said. "I'm going to take him apart piece by piece." Her lips curved in a small, wary smile. Quiet demolition. He leaned back. Exactly. No noise, no drama. Later that day, he drove to a construction site on the outskirts of town. The site manager, Frank Turner, an old employee Jason had fired 6 months earlier, was supervising a small crew. Frank turned when he saw Harold and broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Didn't expect to see you here, boss." Harold shook his hand. "You still call me that. You earned it." Frank's smile faded. "Your boy didn't see it that way." "I know," Harold replied. "That's why I'm here." They sat on the tailgate of a pickup, the smell of wet soil and diesel thick in the air. Harold explained what he'd found: Jason's offshore accounts, the fraud, the manipulation. Frank listened quietly, jaw tight. When he fired me, Frank said the company didn't need dead weight from the past. I gave that man 20 years. Harold met his eyes. Help me fix what he broke. Frank nodded without hesitation. Whatever you need. That afternoon, Frank handed Harold a USB drive. Every project file from the last year. I kept backups. The kid was sloppy. He falsified cost reports to move cash into side accounts. You'll find everything there. Harold took the drive, gripping it like a weapon. This isn't revenge, Frank. It's correction. Frank smirked. Call it whatever you want, boss. Just make it hurt. By the next morning, Laura had drafted the petition for a corporate audit. They met in her office again, blinds drawn. She slid the document across the table. This will trigger a mandatory review by the State Finance Board, she said. If Jason moved funds illegally, they'll freeze his assets during the investigation. But it'll get messy fast. He'll know someone started it. Harold studied the papers for a long time, then picked up a pen. Can we file it anonymously? I can try. Do it. He signed with steady hand. Once the audit starts, he won't be able to move a dime without leaving a trail. Laura gave a grim nod. Let's see how he runs when the floor starts cracking. Within a week, the cracks appeared. Jason's office went into chaos after the notice arrived. Harold heard from contacts inside the company that Jason had erupted in rage, accusing accountants, firing managers, shouting into phones. The banks froze major accounts pending verification. Contractors began pulling out of projects. Grace called Harold one night, voice trembling. He's losing it. He keeps pacing, yelling about someone sabotaging him. He's convinced it's you. Harold didn't deny it. Everyone reveals themselves when they think they're being watched. Harold, please, Grace pleaded. He's terrified. He should be, Harold said softly. It's the first honest reaction he's had in years. Before hanging up, Grace said, there's something else. He's been transferring smaller amounts to personal accounts in Monaco. I found the receipts. Keep them safe, Harold told her. They'll matter soon. The next day, he met Jake Nolan in a quiet warehouse on the city's edge, the same place where Bennett and Sons had started decades earlier. Dust hung in the air like history. Jake placed a folder on the table. You were right. He set up 3 offshore accounts. 2 are in the Caymans, but the 3rd goes through Delaware. That's domestic jurisdiction. You can nail him on that. Harold looked through the file's pages of wire transfers and company names. That's our detonator. Jake chuckled. You really think you can bring him down without touching him? I don't need to touch him, Harold said. He'll fall on his own foundation. Jake leaned back, studying him. You always were the calm kind of dangerous. As the weeks passed, the plan unfolded perfectly. The court-approved audit expanded into Jason's personal holdings. Investors began demanding explanations. Media outlets started whispering about irregularities in Bennett Global's accounts. Jason, in his arrogance, tried to spin the narrative, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that older management had sabotaged him. But Harold had anticipated every word. Laura had sent the right documents to the right people quietly, legally, with surgical precision. Each step tightened the noose without leaving Harold's name anywhere near the paperwork. One evening, Harold sat in his den watching the city lights blink through the window. On the table before him were photos of Elaine, Jason, and Ethan. The boy's smile reminded him of a time before all of this. He whispered into the empty room, Elaine, I'm not destroying our son. I'm saving what's left of him. The phone buzzed. It was Laura. The court approved the audit extension. Jason's financials are now fully frozen. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling. perfect. From that point on, Jason couldn't move a dollar without a signature he no longer had. He began calling old contacts, trying to buy time, but no one would risk association. Every lie, every false report, every inflated invoice was coming back like an echo he couldn't silence. Harold felt no joy, only a quiet sense of inevitability. He wasn't punishing his son, he was teaching him what consequences looked like. That night he wrote in his notebook again. Beneath the heading, Operation Containment, he drew a single line and wrote one word beside it: cracking. Then he turned off the light and went upstairs, the city still humming below, unaware that a quiet war between father and son was nearing its breaking point. Cameras flashed as Jason Bennett stepped up to the microphone, his expression confident and carefully rehearsed. The sleek backdrop behind him read, "Bennett Global Developments, the future of construction." Reporters filled the room, their lenses reflecting the ambition on his face. Today, Jason began his tone smooth and commanding marks. The beginning of a new era for our company. My father's legacy continues under new leadership, mine. The audience clapped, some half-heartedly, some eagerly. Harold Bennett watched the live stream from his office, coffee untouched, jaw set. The applause on screen sounded hollow. A reporter asked, "Will your father still be involved in company decisions?" Jason smiled just enough to look gracious. "My father's retired, enjoying a well-earned rest. I'm taking things from here." Harold didn't move, didn't even blink. On the screen, his son looked powerful, charming, everything the press adored. Yet behind that smile, Harold saw it clearly: fear, greed, and the beginning of a fall. When the press conference ended, Jason walked off the stage, soaking in his moment. The cameras cut, but the performance didn't. At home that night, he poured himself whiskey and found Grace sitting at the dining table, her face pale. "You humiliated your father today," she said quietly. Jason waved a hand. "He's fine. It's business." "You called him retired," she pressed. "He didn't retire, Jason. You pushed him out." Jason leaned on the chair, smirking. "You don't understand how this works. Perception is everything. Investors want youth energy. They want me." Grace stared at him, voice trembling. "What about respect?" He laughed softly. "Respect doesn't build skyscrapers." Grace turned away, eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're turning into someone I don't recognize." Jason's tone softened, but only slightly. "Everything I'm doing for our future, for Ethan. He'll inherit something bigger than either of us." Grace looked back at him, her voice breaking. "Not if you destroy everything first." He said nothing. For the first time, her words hit something buried beneath his arrogance. But instead of guilt, it only made him defensive. Meanwhile, Harold sat in his den watching the replay of Jason's press conference, frame by frame. He noted every financial term, every promise of expansion, every number that didn't match reality. Overstated revenue, false projections, no supporting contracts. He muttered, jotting notes. He paused the video when Jason boasted about secured overseas partnerships with foreign investors. Harold rewound and listened again. The figures were fabricated. Jason had lied publicly to attract capital. He picked up the phone. "Laura," he said, "get me a recording of today's broadcast. You planning to sue?" she asked. "Not yet," Harold said. "But he just confessed to fraud on national television. We'll use it when the time's right." That night, Harold stayed up late rewatching the footage, marking timestamps, collecting the evidence piece by piece. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. And Jason had just handed him the proof himself. The next week, Jason called an emergency board meeting at Bennett Global. His energy was manic, fueled by caffeine and paranoia. When Harold arrived, no one looked him in the eye. Jason stood at the head of the conference table. "Effective immediately. We're restructuring leadership. Anyone clinging to the old ways, consider this your retirement notice. One of the senior partners, Frank Turner, the same man Jason had fired once before, spoke up. You're throwing away the foundation your father built. Jason's jaw tightened. My father is the past. This company belongs to the future. Frank stood, eyes burning. You can't build the future by erasing the past. Jason's tone turned icy. Watch me. Frank gathered his files, walked toward the door, and paused beside Harold. You don't deserve this, he said quietly. Harold gave a faint nod. He'll understand soon enough. That evening, Laura called Harold again. Jason's isolating himself. Half his staff just quit. That's fine, Harold said. Isolation is how the walls start to fall. Grace visited Harold a few nights later, bringing Ethan along. The boy ran into his grandfather's arms with a grin that melted away the fatigue in Harold's face. Grandpa, look what I drew, Ethan said proudly, showing him a picture of a tall building labeled Bennett Towers. Harold smiled, running a hand over his grandson's hair. That's a good one. Strong lines. You build better than your dad already. Grace sat quietly on the couch, her hands clasped tight. He's changing, Harold. He barely comes home. He's paranoid angry. He keeps talking about offshore projects and moving money again. Harold looked up, his tone steady. He's playing a dangerous game, the kind that always ends the same way. She hesitated before reaching into her purse. I don't know if this helps, but I found something. She handed him a flash drive. It's from his home office emails, transfers, documents. He doesn't know I saw them. Harold turned the small device over in his hand. Grace, this could destroy him. Her voice broke. Then maybe it'll save what's left. After they left, Harold sat in his office, the drive glowing under his desk lamp. He opened the files, scrolling through the digital trail Jason had left behind. Transactions, fake invoices, shell company registrations, proof of every illegal move he'd made. He closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I gave him everything, he said softly, thinking it would teach him gratitude. I should have taught him consequence. He picked up his notebook and wrote a new line under Operation Containment Stage 2, Containment Achieved. Stage 3, Exposure. The next morning, Jason stood in his penthouse office, staring at the skyline. From here, Denver looked small, manageable, like something he could control. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls from lawyers and journalists, all asking the same question about the audit. He ignored them, muttering under his breath, I'll fix it. I'll fix everything. His assistant stepped in nervously. Mr. Bennett, the auditors want updated documentation. Jason snapped, Tell them they'll get it when I say so. The assistant nodded quickly and left. Alone again, Jason poured another drink. He didn't notice the camera crews outside the building reporting on the company's financial freeze. Back at his house, Harold sat by the window, watching the first snow of the season drift down. The city lights shimmered through it like faint memories. He whispered to himself, If arrogance built his tower, truth will bring it down. He reached for his phone and called Laura. Harold, she answered, her voice tense. Begin the filings, he said. It's time. When the call ended, he looked once more at the old photo of Bennett and Sons' first team workers in hard hats, smiles wide, holding a sign that read, Built to Last. He ran a finger over the image, then whispered, Let's see if the name still means something. The following day, the story broke on local business networks. State court expands investigation into Bennett global fraud allegations. Jason's name was everywhere, TV, radio, the internet. He watched the coverage in disbelief, veins pulsing in his temples. When Grace came home that night, he was pacing the living room. He did this, Jason hissed. He's behind it all. Grace didn't argue. Maybe he's just finally standing up for what you took. Jason stopped pacing, eyes burning. He won't win. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Across town, Harold closed his notebook and shut off the lamp. In the quiet, he could hear the faint hum of the city below, a sound he had once associated with progress, now with reckoning. He whispered into the dark, Stage 3 begins tomorrow. And for the first time in years, Harold Bennett slept soundly. Harold sat in his office at dawn, the gray light spilling across the blueprints spread before him. But these weren't building plans anymore. They were maps of power, money, and deceit. Lines of ink connected names, accounts, and shell corporations. In the center, circled twice, was Jason's empire. He picked up a pen, wrote across the top of the page in bold letters, Operation Containment. Buildings fall from within, he murmured. So do empires. He closed his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and headed out. The chill of early winter bit at his face as he walked to his truck. Today would be the first real strike. By mid-morning, Harold found himself at a familiar bar on the west side of town, the kind of place construction crews gathered after long shifts. The air smelled of old wood and whiskey. At a corner table sat Frank Turner, the foreman Jason had fired months earlier. Frank, Harold said, pulling out a chair. Boss Frank greeted him, though the title sounded half nostalgic, half bitter. Didn't think I'd see you again after the kid took over. Harold gave a small smile. Neither did I. They ordered coffee. When the bartender left, Harold placed a small folder on the table. Jason used your name to authorize false cost reports. I need the backups from last year's projects. Frank blinked. So that's what this is about. The kid finally dug his own grave. Harold didn't answer directly. He built something on sand. I'm just letting the tide in. Frank looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. You got guts, old man. Most people would have walked away. I don't walk away from foundations with my name on them. 2 hours later, Harold left the bar with a flash drive in his pocket documents that proved Jason had inflated project expenses to funnel company funds into his private accounts. Back in his office, Laura was waiting. She had spent the morning drafting the formal request for an audit. The papers were stacked neatly on the desk. This will trigger a full financial review, she said. Once the court signs off, Jason won't be able to move any funds. But if we file it under your name, he'll know immediately. Then don't file it under mine, Harold said. Laura raised an eyebrow. You want to go anonymous? That'll make it harder to manage. He leaned forward. Anonymous means silent, and silence keeps him guessing. She hesitated, then nodded. All right. I'll move it through a proxy firm. If the board approves the request, his accounts will be frozen within a week. Harold signed the document, steady and precise. Do it. 3 days later, Jason's world began to shrink. It started with a call from his bank, then another. Payments declined, projects stalled, investors started asking questions. By the 5th day, Bennett Global was under review by the State Finance Board. Harold didn't celebrate. He watched from afar as the storm he'd built began to roll in. Grace called one night, panic in her voice. He's losing it, Harold. He's yelling at everyone, says someone's sabotaging him. Let him think that, Harold said. Fear shows you who people really are. He's barely sleeping. He's drinking again. Please, whatever this is, stop before it destroys him. Harold paused. Grace, he destroyed himself the moment he forgot who he was. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Grace said quietly, He's still your son. I know, Harold whispered. That's why I'm doing this clean. The next morning, Jake Nolan called. You won't believe this, he said. We traced one of Jason's Delaware companies. It links directly to his personal name. He's been moving money offshore under false project codes. Harold's voice was calm. How much? About 8 million total. That's enough. Harold leaned back in his chair. Send the files to Laura. It's time to tighten the net. Jake hesitated. You sure you want to go through with this? You nail him, he'll be finished for good. Harold's tone stayed even. He'll be finished when he learns what consequence means. That night, Harold returned to his old garage, the place where Bennett & Sons had started. Dust hung in the air, thick and golden under the single bulb. He opened a wooden crate in the corner and pulled out an old sign, Bennett & Sons Construction, built to last. He ran a thumb over the faded paint. You forgot the last part, Jason, he murmured. Built to last. Then he took out his phone and made a single call. Laura, he said, file the motion with the state. Make it official. At that exact moment, Jason sat in his office high above downtown, pacing as his assistant read updates aloud. Another delay, sir. The State Finance Board expanded their audit request. Several accounts are temporarily restricted. Jason slammed his fist on the desk. Temporarily. That means they can be reopened. Get our lawyers on this. The assistant nodded quickly, but Jason wasn't listening anymore. He was dialing his phone. Grace didn't pick up. Neither did any of his investors. The empire he'd built on charm and borrowed respect was crumbling faster than he could react. Meanwhile, Harold watched from his study window as snow began to fall outside. The phone rang again. It was Laura. It's done, she said. The court approved the audit. Everything under Bennett Global is frozen. Harold closed his eyes, relief and exhaustion mixing into something almost like peace. Thank you. He set the phone down and poured himself a drink. He didn't toast. He didn't smile. He simply stared at the window, at his own reflection. A man who had spent his life building things to stand forever, now tearing one down because it had been built on lies. Late that night, Harold pulled his old leather notebook closer and began to write. The pen scratched slowly across the page. Stage 3 exposure. Then beneath it, he used the law to steal from me. I'll use the law to take everything back. The following day, news hit the local business networks, Bennett Global under state investigation for financial misconduct. Harold's phone buzzed all morning, reporters, former clients, even old colleagues asking for comments. He said nothing. By noon, Jake stopped by with a folder of reports. It's moving fast, he said. They're going to seize documents from his office. By next week, the feds might be involved. Harold nodded. Good. The faster it happens, the less damage he can do. Jake studied him. You're calm. Too calm. Harold gave a faint smile. I've spent my life learning how to build under pressure. This isn't pressure, it's patience. That evening, Grace showed up at his doorstep. Her eyes were red. He's terrified, Harold. He says you're behind everything. Harold looked at her gently. He's right. She took a step back, shocked. But not the way he thinks, Harold added. I didn't destroy him. I showed the world what he did. That's justice, Grace, not revenge. Tears welled in her eyes. He's your son. And he always will be, Harold said softly. But he has to face the truth himself. Grace nodded slowly, defeated, and left without another word. When the door closed, Harold sat back down, staring at the flickering fireplace. The glow cast long shadows across the room, each one reminding him of the past he was both avenging and preserving. He whispered to the silence, Elaine, I kept my promise. Family before business, even now. Outside, the snow kept falling soft, relentless quiet. By morning, the world would know what Jason Bennett had done. And Harold Bennett, the man once known only as a builder, had become something else entirely, the architect of justice. Jason's voice thundered through the glass walls of the boardroom. "Who authorized this freeze?" he shouted, slamming a stack of reports onto the table. "Find me the name." Now. The executives exchanged nervous glances. No one dared to speak. Outside the tall windows, the Denver skyline glimmered under a cold morning sun. Inside the empire Jason Bennett had built on charm and confidence was beginning to crumble. "Sir," one of the junior accountants stammered, "the order came from the State Finance Board. The audit's been escalated to federal review. They say there's reason to believe in criminal mismanagement." Jason's eyes went wide. "Criminal?" He laughed bitterly. "I built this company from the ground up." Another voice from the far end of the table, older, steadier. "No," said Frank Turner, the foreman Jason had fired and later rehired out of desperation. "Your father built it. You just changed the sign." The room went silent. Jason turned toward him, face flushed with fury. "Get out," he said. Frank gathered his papers calmly. "Good luck holding it together," he muttered, leaving without another glance. When the door closed, Jason stared at the empty chairs. His pulse hammered in his temples. For the first time he realized no one in the room was loyal to him, only to their paychecks. Across town, Harold listened to the same chaos through a radio broadcast. The financial news reporter spoke in clipped tones. "Bennett Global, under investigation for fraud and corporate misconduct. CEO Jason Bennett has yet to issue a statement." Harold poured himself a cup of coffee, steady hands, betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. "I told you, Jason," he whispered to the empty room. "The floor always cracks from the inside." The phone rang. Laura's voice came through brisk, but tinged with satisfaction. "He's in full panic mode. Investors are bailing. I just got word he fired half his staff." Harold's tone was calm. "Good. Panic leaves trails. Let's follow them." He made notes as she talked, recording every move, every desperate action his son took. When the call ended, he sat in silence for a moment, then crossed out containment in his notebook and wrote Stage 5. Collapse. At that same moment, Jason was pacing his penthouse office phone pressed to his ear. "You listen to me, Tom," he said through clenched teeth. "This audit is temporary. I can fix it. I just need liquid cash transfer what's left of our overseas assets." On the other end, his business partner stammered. "Jason, those accounts are frozen too. The feds flagged the transfers. You're out of moves." Jason slammed the phone down so hard the screen shattered. "No one tells me I'm out of moves," he growled. When Grace came home that night, she found him sitting in the dark, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. "Jason," she said carefully. He didn't look up. "They're trying to destroy me. Who, my father? Who else? He's behind all of this. He's been waiting for me to fail." Grace stepped closer. "You've been lying for months, Jason. To me, to him, to everyone. Maybe this isn't about your father anymore." He looked up sharply, eyes burning. "Don't you dare take his side." "I'm not taking sides," she said softly. "I'm just tired of watching you become someone you're not." He stood abruptly, knocking the glass to the floor. "You think I'm him? You think I'm some old man clinging to the past?" She shook her head, tears forming. "No. I think you're a man who forgot what the future costs." Jason's anger faltered, replaced by something colder, fear. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every sound in the apartment felt like judgment. The ticking clock, the wind rattling the balcony door, the quiet hum of a life falling apart. Across town, Harold met Jake Nolan in an old diner off Highway 36. The smell of coffee and bacon hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the tension at their table. Jake slid a folder across the counter. "You were right. He's trying to reroute cash to Monaco. Multiple attempts. Each one gets blocked faster than the last. Harold flipped through the documents. He's desperate. Jake nodded. Desperation makes mistakes. You've got him boxed in. Harold set the folder down. I don't want to destroy him, Jake. I just want him to understand. Jake studied him for a moment. You sure that's not the same thing? Harold's eyes met his calm, but hard. No. Destruction ends things. Understanding rebuilds them. By morning, the media had turned Jason's collapse into spectacle. Reporters crowded outside Bennett Global headquarters. Cameras followed him from car to lobby, shouting questions. Mr. Bennett, do you deny the charges? Did your father sabotage you? Jason said nothing. He kept walking sunglasses, hiding the exhaustion carved into his face. Inside the elevator, he caught his reflection in the mirrored wall, hair-disheveled suit, wrinkled eyes bloodshot. The man staring back didn't look powerful anymore. He looked haunted. That evening, Grace called Harold. He's unraveling, she said. He won't eat, he won't sleep. He keeps saying you've won. Harold was quiet for a moment. This was never about winning. Then what is it about balance? Harold said softly. And teaching him that every structure, no matter how high, needs a foundation of truth. Grace's voice cracked. He still loves you, you know. He just doesn't know how to show it. Harold sighed. Then it's time he learned. Late that night, Harold sat in his living room, a single lamp casting shadows across the walls. His phone buzzed. It was Jason. He answered. You happy now? Jason's voice was low, hoarse. You ruined me, old man. Harold took a slow breath. No, son. You did that yourself. Jason laughed bitterly. You taught me to fight, remember? And to build, Harold said quietly. You forgot the second part. Silence stretched between them. Then Jason's voice broke. I just wanted you to be proud of me. Harold closed his eyes. I was, until you stopped being proud of yourself. Jason didn't answer. The line went dead. The next morning, the front page of the Denver Chronicle read, Federal agents seize Bennett Global records in ongoing investigation. The article detailed Jason's fall, his frozen accounts, his pending charges, his shattered reputation. Harold read the article once, folded it neatly, and set it aside. Laura arrived soon after with a cup of coffee. It's over, she said softly. The company's under receivership. Jason's out. Harold nodded. Then we moved to the next phase. She frowned. What's that reclamation? That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Harold stood by the window of his office. Below, the city lights flickered to life one by one. He thought of Jason, his ambition, his downfall, the lessons neither of them had wanted to learn this way. He whispered, You built your empire on glass, son. I built mine on stone. That's the difference. Then he turned off the light and left the room. Behind him, the skyline glowed a mosaic of glass and steel, fragile, yet enduring. Somewhere out there, Jason was staring at the same city, realizing for the first time what it truly meant to lose everything, except the truth. The morning light broke through the clouds over Denver, soft and muted, painting the skyline in pale gold. Harold Bennett stood outside the glass tower, once known as Bennett Global. Workers were on scaffolds, removing the bold metallic letters that had spelled his son's empire, the last one left dangling. Bennett swayed slightly in the wind before coming loose. He watched in silence. That name had survived wars, recessions, and betrayal. It had outlasted his own mistakes. When the final letter was lowered to the ground, Harold whispered, Names survive when character does. He turned and walked inside. The building's marble lobby echoed with every step of his boots. People paused as he passed, some nodding respectfully, others avoiding eye contact. He could feel their uncertainty, their quiet relief. The tyrant was gone. The founder had returned. Laura Myers waited for him on the 20th floor, surrounded by papers, court orders, and audit reports. The receivership order came through, she said, handing him a folder. You're officially back in control of all company assets. The state has restored ownership to your name. Harold accepted the folder, flipping through the pages slowly. And Jason? His accounts are frozen pending the criminal investigation. The prosecutors are preparing formal charges. He's cooperating for now. Harold closed the folder and set it down. Good. Maybe he's finally learning what accountability feels like. Laura hesitated, then asked quietly, "What do you want to do with the company?" He looked out the window at the city below. "The same thing I've always done," he said. "Build something that lasts." When the board gathered that afternoon, the tension was thick. Harold stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the polished wood. Half of the directors had resigned during Jason's reign. The rest looked relieved to see the old man back. "Let's be clear," Harold began. "This company forgot what made it great. We don't build towers for ego. We build foundations for people who need them. That changes today." A young executive spoke up timidly. "Sir, are we keeping the name Bennett global?" Harold paused. "No, we're returning to what it was meant to be." He gestured toward the wall where the logo still hung. Bennett and Sons Construction. That name was built with blood, not branding. The room fell silent for a beat. Then one by one the directors nodded. The decision was unanimous. Later that evening, Harold walked the halls of the building, every step a memory. The floors smelled of dust and old paint. He passed by the same conference room where Jason had once stood proudly in front of reporters declaring a new generation of leadership. Now the chairs sat empty, the screens dark. He paused in the doorway, recalling the boy Jason used to be, the one who followed him to job sites asking endless questions about bolts and beams. He wondered when that boy had disappeared, replaced by a man who believed money was stronger than integrity. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Jake Nolan, wearing his familiar gray jacket and carrying a folder under one arm. Jake grinned. "You did it, old friend. The company's yours again." Harold gestured for him to sit. "Ours," he said. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jake dropped into a chair. "So what now? Press charges? Go for the kill?" Harold shook his head. "No kills, just lessons." Jake frowned. "You really think he'll learn anything sitting in a courtroom?" "Maybe not there," Harold said, "but he'll have time. Reflection requires walls, Jake. Sometimes those walls just happen to be made of concrete and bars." Jake studied him. "You're not angry anymore." Harold gave a faint smile. Anger built nothing. Patience did. By the next morning, the company's restoration had made the headlines, "Founder Harold Bennett regains control of Bennett & Sons Construction." Reporters called it poetic justice. Investors called it a return to stability. Harold called it balance. Grace arrived at his home later that day. Her eyes were red, but she looked steadier than he'd seen her in months. She sat at the kitchen table, twisting her wedding band in her fingers. "He's not sleeping," she said quietly. "The investigators come every day. He's scared." "He should be," Harold said. "Fear's the first honest thing he's felt in years." Grace met his eyes. "He's starting to realize what he's done. He told me he wishes he could take it all back." Harold leaned back in his chair. "Regret's easy when you've lost everything. Redemption takes work." She hesitated. "He wants to see you." Harold looked toward the window, the snow beginning to fall outside. "Not yet. Let him face what he built first." When Grace left, Harold sat in silence for a long time. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock on the mantel. He reached for the old photograph of Elaine and brushed the dust from the glass. "You'd have handled him better than I did," he murmured. Her smile in the picture never changed, but somehow it felt like she was agreeing. The next morning, Harold walked into the old workshop behind the house, the same place where the company had started 40 years ago. The smell of sawdust and oil greeted him like an old friend. He ran his fingers across the worn workbench, tracing the initials carved into it, H+E. He opened a drawer and found a folded blueprint from the company's first project. In the corner, 2 signatures, H. Bennett, and written in childish scrawl, "Jason Bennett, future boss." Harold smiled sadly. "You got half of that right, son." Later that day, Laura came by with updates. "The court officially reinstated your rights as majority owner," she said. "Everything's back under your name. Legally, financially, symbolically, you're home." Harold nodded. "Home." He closed the folder she handed him and said, "But I don't want a monument to victory. I want a foundation for the next generation." Laura tilted her head. "You mean Ethan?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe one day." In the afternoon, Harold visited the new Bennett Foundation headquarters, a sleek, modest building that replaced the lavish offices Jason had once owned. A bronze plaque on the wall caught the sunlight, Elaine Bennett Foundation, dedicated to rebuilding families and futures. He ran his hand over the name, whispering, "You'd like this, love. It's finally what it was meant to be." As he turned to leave, a group of volunteers passed by, young engineers and construction apprentices starting their first day. One of them smiled at him shyly. "Mr. Bennett, you built this, right?" He nodded. "Not this one. But I built the people who did." The kid grinned. "Well, you built good." Outside, the air was crisp. The city skyline shimmered, no longer a battlefield of pride, but a monument to lessons learned. That evening, Harold sat in his study, the light fading to a soft amber glow. The hum of the city filtered through the window. He picked up his pen and opened his notebook again, crossing out Operation Containment and writing a new title, Operation Reclaim. Complete. Beneath it, he added one final note: "I took back my company. Now it's time to take back my family." He closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf, and leaned back in his chair. Outside, snow began to fall again, steady and peaceful. The world moved forward as it always did. But for Harold Bennett, the weight had finally shifted from anger to clarity, from loss to purpose. And somewhere across the city, a son sat alone, finally beginning to understand what his father had built and why it had never fallen. The morning light broke across Denver in a pale wash, the kind that made the glass towers look fragile. Harold Bennett stood outside what had once been Bennett Global Hands in his coat pockets, watching workmen on scaffolds unbolt the metal letters from the facade. One by one they came down, until only the first remained. Bennett swaying against the wind, before it too was lowered away. He didn't move. That name had outlasted ambition, greed, and pride. When the final letter was gone, he whispered, "Names survive when character does." Inside, the marble lobby was silent, except for the echo of his steps. People at the reception desk froze as he passed. Some straightened, some avoided his eyes. He could feel the hush following him through the hall, the strange mix of respect and fear that power leaves behind. Laura was waiting on the 20th floor, surrounded by stacks of paper and glowing computer screens. "The court confirmed the receivership," she said, handing him a thick folder. "Everything's back under your name. You're the legal owner again." Harold opened the folder, scanning the signatures. "And Jason," she hesitated. "Still cooperating. His accounts are locked. He's lost everything." "Not everything," Harold said quietly. "He still has time to face what he's done." By noon, the board of directors gathered in the glass conference room that overlooked the city. Harold took the chair at the head of the table, The air smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. "Let's get one thing straight," he said. "This company forgot what it was built for. We don't sell illusions, we build things that stand." Someone asked, "What about the brand Sir Bennett Global has name recognition?" Harold looked up at the logo on the wall. "We're going back to Bennett & Sons Construction. A good name doesn't need gloss." No one argued. They just nodded, relieved to have someone to follow again. That evening, Harold walked through the quiet corridors. The offices Jason had remodeled were pristine and lifeless. The expensive furniture, the gleaming walls, the echo of his son's ambition, it all felt hollow. He stopped in front of the boardroom window, where Jason had once stood during his first press conference. He remembered the pride in his son's voice, the way Elaine had smiled at them both. A knock pulled him back. Jake Nolan leaned against the doorway, holding a folder. "Well, you did it," he said. "He's out. You're back on top." Harold gestured for him to sit. This was never about being on top. Jake slid into a chair. "So what's next? Prosecute him. Finish it." Harold shook his head. "No, I've taken enough. What's left for him to lose is between him and himself." Jake studied him. "You're not angry anymore. Anger's for men who don't understand patience," Harold said. The next morning's paper carried the headline, "Founder Restores Bennett & Sons Legacy." The business channels called it redemption. Harold called it balance. Grace came by that afternoon, tired but composed. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, turning her mug between her hands. "He's broken," she said. "They've stripped everything. He doesn't talk much anymore." "He will," Harold answered, "when the noise finally stops." She nodded. "He told me he wishes he'd listened to you. He said he built something without a foundation." Harold smiled faintly. "Then maybe he finally understands the first rule of construction." Grace hesitated. "He wants to see you." "Not yet," Harold said. "Let him learn what silence teaches before he hears my voice again." When she left, he walked through the house, the same one Elaine had filled with light years ago. He stopped at her picture on the mantel. "You'd know what to say," he whispered. Her smile in the photo was calm, forgiving, eternal. Later that night, he drove to the old workshop behind the house. Dust hung in the beam of his flashlight. He ran his hand along the workbench over the initials he and Elaine had carved, H+E. In a drawer, he found a rolled blueprint, brittle with age. In the corner were two signatures, H. Bennett, and written in crooked letters, "Jason Bennett, future boss." He traced the words with his thumb. "You got half of it right," he murmured. The next day, Laura met him in his office. "Everything's official now," she said. "The company, the assets, even the name." "It's yours again, home again," Harold said, closing the folder. "But this time we do it differently. We build for people, not pride." She smiled. "Elaine would like that." He nodded. "She already does." That afternoon, he visited the new Bennett Foundation building, a modest glass structure downtown with a plaque at the entrance that read, "Elaine Bennett Foundation, Rebuilding Families, Rebuilding Futures." Volunteers bustled through the lobby, their laughter soft and real. A young engineer stopped him near the stairs. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for starting this," she said. "You gave us a chance?" He smiled. "No. You're the ones giving the world a chance." By sunset, the city glowed gold again. From his office window, Harold could see cranes moving along the horizon, lifting steel beams into place. The rhythm was familiar, the heartbeat of creation. He picked up his old notebook and crossed out the last line of Operation Containment. Beneath it, he wrote, "Reclaim complete." Then, after a pause, another line, "Next family." The light outside dimmed, but his reflection in the glass looked steady, older, and at peace. Somewhere in the city, his son was beginning to understand what it meant to start over. And for the first time in a long time, Harold believed they both could. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Harold Bennett's study, painting thin lines of gold across the hardwood floor. A newspaper sat folded on the table, the headline, bold enough to see from across the room, Bennett Global CEO, under federal investigation. Harold didn't smile. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked out the window toward the city that had once carried his name on every skyline. Outside workers were removing the gleaming sign from the glass tower Jason had renamed Bennett Global. Only one word still hung there, shining stubbornly in the light: Bennett. He whispered to himself. Names survive when character does. The phone rang. Laura's voice was steady but laced with relief. The court's issued a receivership order. The assets and company shares are being returned to you, Harold. You're officially back in control. For a long moment he said nothing. The words felt heavy, not triumphant. No, he said finally. Not back. Just home. Later that morning, Harold arrived at the old headquarters, the one Jason had turned into a monument of arrogance. The lobby was eerily quiet, the employees uncertain whether to greet him or avoid him. When he stepped inside, conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward him, not in fear, but in respect. He gave a single nod and walked toward the elevator. "Let's get to work," he said, voice calm, but carrying the weight of command they all remembered. In the conference room, Laura spread out documents, court orders, settlement offers, financial freezes. "Jason's lawyers are pushing for leniency," she said. "But the evidence is airtight. Fraud, embezzlement, offshore laundering. You have every right to press full charges." Harold picked up one of the papers and looked at it in silence. "I don't need revenge, Laura. I need closure. This isn't about punishing him. It's about protecting what's left of the Bennett name." Laura nodded slowly. "Then consider this the first step in rebuilding it." That afternoon, he met Jake Nolan at an old construction site on the edge of the city, their first project long ago. The steel framework still stood strong, though time had worn its surface. Jake leaned against a pickup, grinning. "You did it." "He's finished." Harold took a slow breath. "No one's ever finished, Jake. He'll serve his time, maybe rebuild himself someday." Jake studied him. "You're not pressing the big charges." Harold shook his head. "He used the law to destroy people. I'll use the law to give him a lesson." Jake let out a low whistle. "You always were a patient bastard." Harold smiled faintly. "Patience builds what anger can't." By the end of the week, Jason's name was stripped from every company file. His luxury penthouse had been repossessed and his accounts frozen. The once celebrated young visionary now existed only in headlines about corruption and betrayal. Grace came to Harold's home one evening, her eyes red from crying. She set her purse down and said softly, "He's broken, Harold. He's angry, ashamed, but mostly lost." Harold motioned for her to sit. "He should be, but maybe being lost is what he needs." She nodded slowly. "The investigators say he'll probably serve time, but he's cooperating. He signed over everything to you." Harold glanced at the fire flickering in the hearth. He finally built something honest. Grace's voice trembled. "He asked me to tell you. He's sorry." For a long while, Harold said nothing. Then quietly, "It's a start." The next morning, Harold returned to the headquarters for the official reinstatement. The board of directors stood waiting, nervous and respectful. When he entered the room, rose to its feet. "Please," he said, motioning them to sit. "Titles don't matter anymore. What matters is integrity. This company lost its way, chasing numbers, and forgotten what made it last: trust." He walked to the wall where the Bennett Global logo hung. Reaching up, he removed the word Global himself, leaving only Bennett & Sons Construction. One of the board members asked, "Will you keep the & Sons part?" Harold smiled faintly. Always. Hope's part of legacy, too. Applause filled the room, not out of celebration, but of relief. For the first time in years, the company felt like a family again. Later that day, Harold walked the construction floor, hard hat in hand. The smell of sawdust, concrete, and sweat filled the air. A scent far more honest than the cologne and glass of Jason's office. Workers nodded respectfully as he passed. He stopped beside a young man operating a crane and asked, "How long you been with us?" "3 months, sir," the man said. "Didn't think I'd ever meet the real Mr. Bennett." Harold chuckled softly. "There's nothing real about a name, son. It's what you build that counts." That evening, as the sun dipped low over Denver, Harold stood in his old office again. Dust motes floated in the orange light. He placed a photo of Elaine on the desk beside one of Jason as a boy, both newly cleaned and framed side by side. He whispered, "You were right, Elaine. Legacy isn't money. It's what people remember." Outside, cranes moved against the skyline, rebuilding the same city that had once been his battlefield. But this time he wasn't fighting to win, he was rebuilding to last. Laura knocked softly on the open door. "You should know Jason's hearing is set for next month. His lawyer wants to negotiate a settlement." Harold didn't turn around. "Tell him I'll listen." She hesitated. "You're really going to face him?" He nodded. "I took back my company. Now it's time to take back my family." When she left, Harold lingered by the window, watching headlights trail down the streets like veins of light. The city pulsed below him, alive and restless. He picked up his notebook, the one marked Operation Containment. He drew a line through the title and wrote a single word beneath it: reclamation. The next day, the news networks ran the final story, Bennett and Sons restored under original founder. Commentators called it poetic justice, a victory for integrity. But Harold didn't see it that way. To him, it wasn't victory, it was balance restored. In the afternoon, he visited the new Bennett Foundation headquarters, the charity now named after Elaine. A plaque on the wall read, "Dedicated to rebuilding lives, one family at a time." He ran his fingers over the engraving. "She'd like this," he whispered. When he returned home, the city was blanketed in twilight. Grace and Ethan were sitting on his porch steps waiting. Ethan jumped up and ran to him. "Grandpa, Mom said you got your company back." Harold laughed quietly, lifting him into his arms. "Not just the company, kiddo. Something better." "What's that?" Ethan asked. "My name." As they went inside, the firelight flickered through the windows, warm and steady. For the first time in years, the Bennett house felt like a home again. And when Harold looked at the photo of his family on the mantel, he didn't see the cracks anymore. He saw strength, the kind built from patience, from wisdom, from justice, served not with anger, but with purpose. He took a deep breath, eyes soft but clear. "It's time to rebuild," he said quietly. And the city outside seemed to echo back in the hum of its lights and the rhythm of its heart, a single word that had defined his life from the start. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Jason sat across from his father at a long oak table, hands trembling, eyes hollow from weeks without sleep. The courthouse's private conference room felt colder than any prison cell. "You won," Jason said finally, his voice low and bitter. "Is that what you wanted, Dad?" Harold studied his son quietly. The man sitting before him was a far cry from the arrogant executive who once laughed on television promising the future. His shoulders slumped forward, his skin pale, his pride stripped bare. "I didn't want to win," Harold said softly. "I wanted my son back." Jason let out a sharp laugh, but it cracked halfway through. "You call this getting me back? You ruined me. My company, my reputation gone." Harold leaned back, his gaze steady. "You did that yourself. All I did was stop you before you destroyed everyone else with you." Jason pressed his palms against his eyes, voice trembling. You think I wanted to hurt you? I just wanted to prove I could build something of my own. You had something of your own, Harold said, his tone heavy with sadness. You had my trust. You had a family. You had everything worth keeping, and you traded it for noise. Jason dropped his hands and looked up, eyes wet but defiant. I wanted to be more than your shadow. Harold sighed. You were never my shadow. I built something strong so you wouldn't have to struggle the way I did. I wanted you to have choices, not chains. But you turned my name into a transaction. Jason's voice broke. I thought success meant freedom. Freedom without integrity. Harold said, is just another kind of prison. For a moment neither spoke. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space between them like a quiet accusation. Then Harold opened the folder in front of him. Inside were 2 sets of papers, one marked prosecution, the other settlement agreement. He pushed the second folder forward. Laura drew this up, he said. If I sign the prosecution file, you'll serve 10 to 15 years. The evidence guarantees it. But if you sign this agreement, you'll cooperate with the investigation, return every stolen dollar, and testify against the others involved. You'll lose your money, your assets, your privileges, but you'll have a chance to rebuild. Jason stared at the folder. You'd let me walk. Harold shook his head. Not walk, crawl. But at least you'll be crawling in the right direction. Jason's throat tightened. Why? After everything I did to you? Harold's eyes softened. Because justice isn't about revenge. It's about balance. And I'm still your father. Jason hesitated, then reached for the pen. His signature trembled across the page. When he set it down, he looked at Harold as if seeing him for the first time in years. I don't deserve this, he said quietly. No, Harold replied. You don't. But that's how redemption starts. For a while they sat in silence, the faint sound of traffic echoing from the street below. Harold studied his son's face, the same determined jaw, the same eyes that once shone with ambition instead of fear. When Jason finally spoke again, his voice was small. What happens now? You make things right, Harold said. You cooperate, you tell the truth, and when you're done, you rebuild not for power but for purpose. Jason nodded slowly, tears beginning to slip down his cheeks. I don't know if I can. Harold's tone was steady. Then start by learning. Jason swallowed hard, his pride finally collapsing. I'm sorry, he whispered. For everything. For Mom. For you. Harold looked down at the table, his jaw tightening. You can't fix the past son, but you can stop it from repeating. Jason nodded again, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him steady. When he finally left the room, Harold stayed seated. Laura stepped in moments later, closing the door behind her. You did the right thing, she said quietly. Harold didn't look up. I don't know if right is the word. Feels more like necessary. He'll have a chance, she said. And you'll have peace. Harold finally met her eyes. Peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from understanding when to stop fighting. Laura smiled faintly. You sound like Elaine. He exhaled through his nose, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. She would have handled this better than I did. She would have been proud of you, Laura said gently. He didn't answer. He just looked toward the window where sunlight stretched across the conference table, like the first clean line of a blueprint. That evening, when Harold returned home, Grace and Ethan were waiting on the porch. Ethan ran to him the second he opened the gate, his small arms wrapping around Harold's waist. Dad says you helped him, Ethan said. Mom says you saved us. Harold knelt down, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, Ethan. I just reminded him what family means." Grace stepped forward, her eyes red but soft. He signed the agreement. "He's working with the investigators. He'll serve time, but it's not prison forever. He told me to tell you thank you." Harold rose to his feet, the weight in his chest both heavy and freeing. "Good. Maybe he'll learn something from it." Grace hesitated. "He already has." They sat together on the porch steps as the sky turned orange and gold. Ethan chased fireflies across the lawn, laughing, his joy unbroken by the storm that had shaken their family. Harold watched him for a long time. "He's got your mother's heart," Grace said quietly. "And his father's stubbornness," Harold replied with a smile. "Let's hope he uses both wisely." Grace looked at him, eyes shimmering. "You gave him a chance, Harold? Most fathers wouldn't have." "I didn't give him a chance," he said softly. "I gave him a lesson. What he does with it, that's up to him." As dusk deepened, Grace and Ethan left. Harold stayed behind the porch light flickering on above him. He opened his old notebook, the same one he'd used since the beginning. On the cover, the faded words, "Operation Reclaim," were still visible. He crossed out "reclaim" and wrote a single word beneath it: "Restore." Inside, he wrote his final entry. "He gave me a $900,000 gift and thought it bought my silence. What I gave him back was truth, the only inheritance that never loses value." He closed the notebook and set it beside Elaine's photograph on the table. In the quiet that followed, he whispered, "It's over, love." The boy finally learned how to build. Through the window, the city shimmered with its late-night lights, alive and restless. A reminder that even after collapse, rebuilding was always possible. Harold sat back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest felt lighter, not because he'd won, but because justice had been done and mercy had found its way through the cracks. The first snow of December fell softly over Denver, blanketing the city in quiet light. Harold Bennett stood by the window of his office, watching flakes drift against the glass. It was early, too early for phone calls or meetings, but the silence suited him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man preparing for battle. On his desk sat two framed photographs, one of Elaine, her smile still gentle and knowing, and another of Jason, Grace, and Ethan, taken years before everything fell apart. The glass over that one had cracked slightly, but Harold hadn't fixed it. Some scars, he thought, were worth keeping. He turned away from the window and walked to his desk. A stack of papers waited for him. Contracts, proposals, new projects for Bennett and Sons. Laura had insisted he start delegating again, that he couldn't run every detail forever. He'd agreed, but not before reviewing every name and every promise. Trust, he'd learned, was a foundation that needed daily maintenance. The phone buzzed. He picked it up. "Mr. Bennett, the receptionist, said your 10 o'clock is here. Send them in." The door opened and a young man stepped in. Early 30s, nervous, holding a portfolio. Harold recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror once. "Mr. Bennett," the man said, shaking his hand. "It's an honor. I grew up hearing about your company. I want to be part of what you're rebuilding." Harold smiled faintly. "We're not rebuilding what was lost," he said. "We're building what should have been." The man nodded, a spark of respect in his eyes. As he left, Harold sat down again, feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction. Legacy wasn't about buildings or bank accounts. It was about the lessons that outlived you. In the afternoon, he drove to the new Bennett Foundation office. The building gleamed with clean lines and wide glass windows, Elaine's design revived and completed years after her death. Inside, a bronze plaque caught the light, "Elaine Bennett Foundation. Building hope one family at a time." Harold stood before it for a long while. "You'd like this," he whispered. You always said the best projects don't end with us. As he walked through the hallway, he heard children laughing from one of the outreach rooms. The sound filled the empty spaces of his heart that even victory hadn't reached. He paused to listen, smiling. Later that evening, Harold sat on his porch with a mug of coffee, the air crisp and clean. Across the street, Grace's car pulled up. She stepped out with Ethan, who ran straight toward him, coat unzipped and cheeks red from the cold. Grandpa Ethan shouted. Dad called. He said he's doing better. Harold's hand tightened around the mug, warmth rising through his chest. He did, huh? Yeah, Ethan said, breathless. He said he's learning carpentry in the correctional program. He built a chair. Mom says he wants to send it to you. Harold smiled, eyes misting. Then I'll keep it right here, he said, pointing to the porch. A reminder that sometimes rebuilding starts small. Grace walked up the steps, her smile gentle but tired. He's changing, Harold. Slowly, but it's real. Thank you for not giving up on him. Harold looked out over the snowy yard, his voice steady. I almost did once. But then I remembered buildings don't stand because the storms never come. They stand because someone keeps fixing what breaks. Grace nodded, tears bright in her eyes. He still wants to see you. Let him finish what he started, Harold said. Then we'll talk. As the evening deepened, the three of them sat together under the soft glow of the porch light. Ethan leaned against Harold's arm, telling stories from school, his laughter rising into the night like music. When they left, Harold stayed outside, listening to the snow crunch beneath their tires as they drove away. He looked up at the stars barely visible through the clouds. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't mind. He whispered, "Justice isn't revenge. It's knowing when to let go." Inside, he opened his old leather notebook one last time. The cover was worn, the ink faded, but every line told a story, a plan, a war, a lesson. He flipped to the final page and wrote, "Legacy is not what we leave behind. It's what we rebuild when everything falls apart." He closed the book, set it on the shelf beside the photograph of his family, and turned off the light. The house was quiet but not empty. He poured himself one last drink for the night and stepped out to the porch again. The wind carried the faint scent of pine from the mountains, the same air he'd breathed when he was young and believed that success was built on steel and stone. Now he knew better. Success was built on endurance, on knowing when to fight, when to forgive, and when to start over. He looked at the porch light flickering against the snow and smiled. "We're still standing," he said softly. "That's enough." The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds. Workers arrived early at the Bennett and Sons site, laughter and chatter rising with the sound of drills and engines. From a distance, Harold watched as the new foreman, a young woman he'd hired last month, directed the crew with confidence and ease. She waved when she saw him. "Morning, Mr. Bennett." He nodded, tipping his hat. "Morning. Keep it level." "Yes, sir," she called back, grinning. He walked along the fence line, hands in his coat pockets. Every clang of steel, every shout of teamwork felt like a hymn to survival. The company, his family, and even his name had nearly been lost. But here it was again, alive, stronger for having been broken. As he turned to leave, a voice called after him. "Mr. Bennett, do you ever think about retiring for real?" Harold paused, then chuckled. Retiring. He looked around at the world he'd rebuilt and the legacy taking shape before him. "Son, I already did. I'm just doing what I love now." That evening, as twilight settled over the city, the Bennett sign glowed against the skyline once more. Not grand, not boastful, just steady. Harold stood across the street watching it, the reflection shimmering in his eyes. He could almost hear Elaine's voice again, soft and sure. "You built something that lasts." He smiled. "We did," he whispered. "We really did." He turned to go, footsteps slow but sure against the snow-covered pavement, the city humming quietly behind him. And as the final light of day faded, one truth lingered in the air, simple, timeless, and earned through everything he had fought for. Sometimes justice isn't about ending the story. It's about beginning again with wisdom, with grace, and with peace. If Harold Bennett's story reminded you that second chances can build stronger foundations than success ever could, share your thoughts below. What would you rebuild if life gave you another chance? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay with us for more stories of justice, redemption, and legacy. See you in the next one.